morning or afternoon, depending on where you're calling in from. I appreciate you taking the time to attend this webinar. Um, and it's really focused on how we can strengthen our teams. So before we jump in, I thought I'd share a quick little story. A current client we were working with asked me why I was so focused on helping create stronger teams. Kind of, why did I get into this? They were curious where my passion came from. Now, he admitted that my answer kind of surprised him because I told him I started on this journey over 2 decades ago when I realized that when I was a people manager, I was actually part of the bigger problem, not part of any solution. It was because of that realization that put me on the path I am now. Now, throughout the webinar, there's going to be multiple polls. Your answers to these polls will be anonymous. If you're not part of a team now, then I'd ask you to think of the last time you were part of a team and answer from that perspective. Now, before we start, I want to ask a question that will not show up anonymously. Please answer in chat if you're comfortable. The question is, what made you join today? So please drop that in chat. All right, be curious, love that word. Help lead teams better. Exploring alternatives, always looking for ways to make safe spaces, love that. All right, great. Appreciate you sharing. And we'll get back to, at the end, we'll have a Q&A, so you can ask questions if we didn't cover any aspects that you wanted to cover. So let's go ahead and jump into the topic at hand. So I was working with a leadership team that believed their communication was super strong, right? Meetings were calm, decisions were getting made, no one was pushing back or aggressive. From the outside, it looked like a really healthy team. But when we looked closer, something really didn't add up. Risks weren't being raised early. Feedback was happening after meetings, in the hallways, behind closed doors, but not in the actual meeting itself. And decisions kept getting revisited and revised weeks later. The team wasn't aligned, and what they were doing was adapting to silence. So most teams don't struggle with communication. They struggle with the conversations they never have. So let's pressure test this for your team. Our first poll is, on your team, how often do people raise concerns early? Always, often, sometimes, or rarely? All right, great. So it looks like it's about half are sometimes, 12% is rarely, 29% often, and 12% is always. Great. So let's close this out. So most leaders that we've done research with and worked with feel like it's often. But when we measure it, it usually lands closer to sometimes. And that gap between what we think is happening and what is actually happening is where most problems start. Now, leaders misread 3 signals all the time. Quiet, meaning agreement. Quiet does not mean agreement, right? Or alignment. It means people are deciding if it's safe to speak. Harmony, equaling health. So harmony on the surface can mean avoidance. Ideas may not be sharpened, they're really being protected, right? Rather than just having them sharpened overall. Productivity equaling trust. Work can move forward even when trust is low. It just shows up later as rework and wears down teams. I've seen teams that look incredibly productive. They're able to achieve tasks faster than most other teams I've seen. But they're solving the same problem 3 times. It was never challenged early. It kept coming back around, and it kept having to be updated. So I would argue that the team isn't truly productive. They continue to change what they're delivering because they don't have trust built within their culture. So let's jump into another poll. And this is where it shows up most clearly. In leadership meetings, what usually happens when someone challenges direction? It improves a decision, it creates healthy debate, it creates tension, or it rarely happens. On leadership meetings, what usually happens when someone challenges the direction? All right. I love seeing that someone said that they it improves the decision because that's too often we don't see that. It creates healthy debate, which is great, 31%. It creates tension, 44%, and it rarely happens, 19%. Okay, great. I appreciate that. So if challenge creates tension or doesn't happen at all, teams learn quickly what's safe. And you'd be surprised at how short that time frame is. I've seen after just a few meetings, team trust disintegrate. Then the challenge becomes larger. But team trust can disappear really quickly, but to regain that trust, to build that back up, that takes longer. Doesn't mean it can't be done. It just means that the approach you take has to be more impactful. So the question becomes, how do you actually see these patterns? Because they're subtle. They don't show up in performance dashboards. They show up in behavior. That's where these four dimensions come in. After years of studying team behavior and reading studies from the experts in the field, we've been able to take our learnings and break them down into four dimensions. We're going to walk through each of these dimensions and show how there's a common thread throughout. At the end, we'll talk about how you can start today, even after our meeting today, making a change within your teams. So let's start with receptive. So we redefine receptive as how your team receives feedback, if they're open to different ideas, and how they look to their colleagues for suggestions. We can further break receptive down to one thing. Do ideas and concerns actually surface? I worked with a team when the team leader said, "My team tells me everything." But when we mapped the behavior, concerns were raised, just not to him. They were raised later after decisions had already been made, smaller groups, in the hallways, after hours, even through chat or private Slack channels. The team wasn't unreceptive, they were selectively receptive, choosing instead to hold their conversations outside the rooms where they belonged. Remember that if people don't feel heard, they don't stop thinking, right? They just stop saying it out loud. And that can cost your leadership team and your company more than just money. It can start to create silos, communication breakdowns, stalled projects, and so much more. If people don't feel heard, they adapt. Let's take this a step further. Think about this on a personal level. Think about how you may have shifted how you interact with your friends, your family, or even your significant other when you haven't felt heard. It can show up in our tone, show up in our voice, our words, our actions, even going as far as keeping score, which we know can destroy relationships. Now, let's jump into our next poll. When someone raises a risk on your team, what typically happens? It gets explored immediately, it gets acknowledged but delayed, it gets minimized, or it gets avoided. So again, when someone raises risk on your team, what typically happens? All right, great. I love seeing that it gets explored immediately as half. That's great. It gets acknowledged but delayed, and then it gets minimized, which is obviously a big concern. So thank you for sharing that. It's great. So you want to watch how your team responds to risk because that will tell you everything. Teams remember what happened the last time someone spoke up. So to change the next time can become more difficult. But the longer you wait, the harder it is. It's like when I continue to say I'm going to clean up the garage the next time, and I put down a tool or a pile of rags. Within a month, I can't find anything because I continue to ignore my actions of placing things haphazardly around wherever they thought I belonged at the time. So this is a perfect example of why I have around 9 tape measures, because I can't find it, so I have to go out and buy another one. Now, moving into adaptive, we define this as how your team changes to increase their impact on the overall organization. So boiling this down, it really means that when ideas surface, do they actually change anything? When I first started in the workplace, I worked with a team that encouraged input. People spoke up, but decisions rarely changed. So over time, myself and my team members, we stopped investing energy in contributing. Not because we weren't heard, but because nothing moved. Now, I'm not saying that you have to follow every piece of input that your team gives you. There may be situations where you can't share all the details, or there might be times where your team members may not be privy to all the data, or you as a leader might not be privy to all the data. But you know you have to move forward with the task given to you. It's more about acknowledging the input and trying to determine how to best address it. Because at the end of the day, if input doesn't change outcomes or is at least acknowledged, then engagement drops quickly and it can be quiet. It can cost you a lot more than money. It can cost you trust within your team. Now, when ideas surface, people need to feel backed. Think about how impactful that is to feel heard. It's really big. Let's jump into our next poll. What is your team's reaction to sudden changes that occur in the company? Adapt quickly, adjust with hesitation, cautious and less vocal, or resist change openly? And keep in mind, this is where this is where adaptability shows up under pressure. Okay, so it looks like there's a little mix. Adapt quickly is great. It can be great. It depends on the situation. Adjust with hesitation, 27%. Resist change openly, 20%. Cautious and less vocal, 13%. All right, thanks for that. Okay, so moving on to supportive. This is how your team promotes their colleagues' ideas, assists with their goals, and works towards collaboration. I saw a leader say all the right things about openness, but when someone challenged a decision in a meeting or in an email, he redirected quickly. It wasn't harsh, it wasn't aggressive. He just moved on, showing little to no acknowledgement. But that was enough. The team learned we can speak, but it won't go anywhere. Teams don't watch what leaders say, they watch what gets reinforced. And based on that reinforcement, it can either elevate a team or reduce the trust that the team may have. By now, we're starting to see a common thread. Across all 4 of these dimensions, trust can be broken quite easily. You can support even with hard conversations. It's about being open and honest. That allows trust to be built, not by running away from the hard conversations, but by embracing it. Now we're going to go into our next poll, which is focusing around when a team member challenges a decision. So when a team member challenges a decision, leaders usually encourage the decision, ask for more data, redirect the conversation, or move the meeting forward. So when a team member challenges a decision, leaders usually. All right. So it seems like there's a lot of ask more data, 60%. So that's good. Hopefully they get the data they need. Redirect the conversation, 20%, and then move the meeting forward, 13%. Yeah. So that can be frustrating for everyone involved. It can really, move trust aside. So we really want to be careful of what that looks like. Um, okay. So this is one of the clearest signals in leadership behavior. Once we're able to answer this question, it allows us to start to embrace where we need to build trust within the team. It's about our actions that will allow us to create a sense of engagement, creating a team that embodies trust rather than runs from it. Now, our final dimension is productive. How effective your team is in achieving the goals set forth from the organization and/or external milestones. Now, the productive dimension is where most leaders focus, right? Often it can be misleading. A few years ago, I worked with a client team that moved really fast. Decisions were quick, execution was strong. From the outside looking in, it was really impressive. But the same issues kept resurfacing because concerns weren't raised early enough. Speed looked like performance, but it was actually avoidance. And we found out rather quickly that the timeline we had in place was going to get pushed and was going to keep getting pushed until we stopped, evaluated where trust was missing, and addressed it from a different perspective. Sometimes speed is clarity, but too often speed is avoidance. You do the job to get it done. While you're paying for 100% of that person on your team, you may be lucky for getting a third of them and what they bring to the team. So is your speed clarity or avoidance? Because if it's avoidance, then it's costing you a lot of wasted time. Our goal is not to create a perfect team. It's to create the ability for the team to continue to grow with you, not against you. This will allow your leadership abilities to show up within your team. For great leaders, allow for the creation of great teams. Let's move on to our final poll. When decisions move quickly on your team, it usually means the thinking was clear, everyone agreed, concerns were minimal, or some concerns surfaced later. So when decisions move quickly on your team, it usually means okay. So it seems like kind of split up and everyone agreed, concerns were minimal, some concerns surfaced. Great. I see no one chose thinking was clear. So this is where leaders start to see the difference. This is where leaders can see how they're showing up for their team, not just for the company. So let's put this all together because these four dimensions don't operate independently. They stack. The question for the receptive dimension is, do we surface risk? Because when receptivity drops, ideas stop surfacing. For adaptive, do we challenge thinking? Because when ideas stop surfacing, adaptability drops. Supportive, do we back each other? Because when adaptability drops, support becomes surface level. Finally, productive, do we sharpen ideas? Because eventually, productivity becomes artificial. This is the part of the most teams miss. Trust doesn't collapse all at once. It narrows slowly. Low receptivity means that ideas stop surfacing. Low adaptability means that decisions don't improve. Low support means that risk-taking drops. Avoided conflict means that problems surface later. Trust rarely breaks loudly. It fades into behaviors teams stop showing. Now, if you take one thing from today, it's this. Low trust within your teams is costing you time and money. It's creating unnecessary tension within yourself and your teams. It doesn't have to be that way. So this week, maybe even today, pick one dimension where your team is struggling. Name that behavior gap out loud and invite one small visible risk. An example might be, in our next meeting, I want someone to challenge my thinking. Now, keep in mind that just because this is your goal doesn't mean it's going to happen all at once. If the trust has been broken, it's going to take time to rebuild that trust. If you want to know how to rebuild that trust quickly, reach out to us. We'll be happy to give you a free assessment for your team that will show you exactly what needs to happen to strengthen your team within each of the 4 dimensions. From there, the sky is the limit on how successful your team can be with you leading them. Happy to take questions, or if you're thinking about your own team, we can talk through that as well. Okay, I see Tim. Is there another option for the poll question? So I'm not sure which poll. I'm assuming that was probably the last one. When decisions move quickly on our team, it usually means. So if there's a different answer you have, feel free to put it in the chat. How do you get help when seeing issues on a colleague's team? Great question, Zoe. One of the ways that I've seen this work really well is typically, and it depends on the organization or how your teams are set up and how you interact with this other person. What I typically do is I'll start being vulnerable first. So if I see that there's a problem on your team, Zoe, then I might bring a similar issue or a similar concern from my perspective that I'm struggling with, right? Kind of being vulnerable and trying to build a relationship with that colleague to try to determine if they're going to be open to hearing what I have to say. Because typically when you ask someone to give feedback about yourself, whether as a leader, as a colleague, whatever that looks like, hopefully it opens the opportunity for them to say, oh, do you have any feedback for me? It may not happen the first time. It might happen the second or the third time. But it's really creating the ability to having them be open to hearing that you have some advice for them, right? If you do have a good relationship with them, excuse me, you do have the capability of maybe approaching them saying, hey, I noticed something. I was wondering if I could share with you, right? And the words that you use are super important. So it's not saying, hey, so I noticed you do this, but you really should be doing this. It's, hey, I noticed this is occurring. I wonder if maybe we work together on this, right? It's not trying to put it all on them or come at them because they'll become defensive. So it really depends on the relationship you have with them on how you want to move forward with that. And if there's something specific, please feel free to email me and I can get into more details. Thoughts on in-person versus work from home teams? Kim, jumping right in, love it. It's been really interesting. I mean, we think back 6 years ago when it was a nightmare for people to work from home. I remember we almost never had video calls. Most of the stuff was over our cell phones. I remember getting frustrated with my team when I heard a dog barking in the background. Now we could have a kid walk up in the middle of a big presentation and everyone's like, oh, that's just normal. There is a different dichotomy when you're dealing with either a blended team or especially just a team that works remote, right? There's different things that are be going on. And so there's some different ways to balance that. One of the things that we really focus on is, people talk about having cameras on or off. Typically what we'll do is we'll do a mix, a blend, right? Because we also know that for some people showing up on camera can be a lot more work than others. So we typically want to have camera on a certain percentage of the time, typically lower, to be able to see how people are, if they're really checking in or if they're not really checked in at all. The other way we do this is doing some short little interactive exercising at the beginning of a meeting, right? It could also be shrinking 30-minute meetings to 25 minutes, 60-minute meetings to 50 minutes. Find different ways to engage and interact with a team is super important when you're dealing with virtual. I work with an entirely virtual team now. And what we typically do when we start off a meeting, we're not talking about what's going on in that specific meeting. We're talking about how are you doing since the last time I spoke? And as a leader, it's making sure you take notes. Okay, so Tim said that his youngest is just going into daycare for the first time, right? So it's making sure the next time we get together, it's saying, "Hey Tim, so how's your kid doing in daycare? Like, how's that like not having them home right now?" Right? It's getting to know them and feel because we're losing a connection. When we're in the office, you're walking by someone, you're chatting with them, talking to the water cooler, maybe grabbing lunch together. It's a very different look and feel. One of the things that we also did was we'd have working hours where we'd grab 3 or 4 people, however big the team was. We'd all be on camera and we'd all be working. No one would really be talking unless they had a question. Someone might be, "Hey Tim, I'm curious about this. Like, I don't understand this part. Can you help me with this?" And other people, we can just go offline. But it's kind of like a working session within the office. We just happen to be all in virtual spaces. So there's different ways to play around with that. Zoe, when these gaps appear on our leadership team and the culture is extremely toxic and unsafe, how do you suggest leaders try to create improvements when the CEO and the EVP are the perpetrators? We see this all the time. And unfortunately, there's certain specific ways to deal with it dependent upon what the situation is. Usually what we try to do is have people or coach them to try to find someone that can be their go-to that's similar to the level or has the voice of the CEO or the EVP, right? People, including CEOs, they want change, but they don't want to have to go through it on their own, right? So finding someone that can mentor you or that can work with you on your behalf to the leadership team and bring up ideas, not in an aggressive way, is super important. The other way is trying to find different ways where you can go to the leadership and say, "Hey, I really want to look at different ways of elevating our leadership. I wonder if we could do a training on X," right? Knowing that it's focusing on things that your leadership may be dealing with. And then when you have, whether an outside firm or you do it yourself, you do that, the training, create situations or ideas that you're going to bring up in the meeting that are similar, but not similar enough to where they're like, "They're calling me out," right? Because what we want to do is we want to make sure that people are belonging. And one of the ways of doing that is as you're building out what that workshop might look like, it's focused on what's important to leadership, the CEO and EVP, right? If it's a publicly traded company, it's the stocks, right? If it's privately held, then it's really how do they look, right? A great, on one of Tim Ferriss's podcasts, I can't remember the name of the gentleman that did this, but he was a great negotiator. And he talked about how you want to write what is their victory speech. So with your EVP and your CEO, what would their victory speech look like? And then work backwards from there, right? Work on how am I going to negotiate to try to get them to start to see what some of the issues may look like. Because at the end of the day, they want to be successful. And if they identify like most men that are leaders, they're focused on their legacy. So by talking their language, talking about their legacy and trying to weave that into the conversation could be beneficial. Okay, Suni, trust seems to be the key factor here, and I agree with that. What do you recommend fundamentally set the foundation for building, nurturing, and repairing trust? I use trust acronym: transparency, relationship building, understanding, shared success, and truth telling. Absolutely. And I love all of those. I think when you're building relationships from a leadership perspective, it's about being vulnerable, right? One of the ways I've done that over the years is from a leadership perspective, when I'm coaching people, it's not just your role within the organization, because we all have lives outside of work, I know in our country, we don't typically see that. I get to spend a lot of time in Europe where I've known people for 3 years now. They have no idea what I do for a living. I have no idea what they do, right? But over here, it's defined on who we are and how we work through that. So one of the biggest things we can do is being vulnerable. So within that trust framework, transparency, I feel that vulnerability falls within that transparency, right? I have a newsletter that I share where I failed within corporate or where I've seen failures in corporate. And then also I tie that back into home because being a leader, we can't be one person at work, one person with our friends and family, and one person with ourselves, right? They all intersect in the center of that Venn diagram, right? So as you're working through these different four acronyms, those are all part of the different areas that would tie directly into the four quadrants that we follow, or the four dimensions that we focus on, which the RASP model. I'm happy to send that over, the entire model that goes into more detail and how that can tie into the trust acronym to give you different tools and different insights on how you can drive change within yourself and within your team and then your organization overall. Because it does take time. And while we may want this to move quickly, once trust is broken, like I gave you that example of asking for people's feedback, just because you want it doesn't mean you're necessarily going to get it, right? Creating vulnerable opportunities where you've shared maybe, hey, I know in the past when you've shared ideas or thoughts, I've shot them down. I was probably stressed. I wasn't focused on the team overall, and I apologize for that. I need your input. So if you feel more comfortable, maybe you write it down anonymously or do an anonymous poll or do something on a Google sheet where people can put in their ideas, start sharing them, and then start sharing them openly at the meeting, right? Because a good leader, like when I was a people manager, I just managed people. I was not a leader, right? Being a leader elevates others. So that's really what we want to focus on is how do we elevate others? Because I can tell you when we had our vice president of marketing at a company I was at for a decade, almost everyone, and this is where I failed as a leader, almost everyone we hired, I'd have them work with her for the first 2 weeks, whether they were in marketing or not. And she came to me, she's like, why does like they're in sales. Why are they working with me first? Like, why aren't they working with you or someone else? And I said, you know what? I'm sorry. I failed you. I said, they're working with you because I think you're a better leader than I am. Because whenever people work with you, they walk away and they're on fire. And while that may happen with me part of the time or a small amount, when they get done with you, working with you for a couple weeks, they're amazing. So I should have probably told you that, and I apologize I didn't. But that's why I have people work with you first, because you were a true leader, right? And that's where we did it. Yeah, it is self-awareness, Zoe. And I think that's what I look back and I cringe. And what's funny is I still keep in touch with the HR rep from when I first got into corporate America. And we actually just talked a few months ago. And she tells me stories of how she almost quit because of me. I was an absolute nightmare. And how proud she is of me, which was hard for me to accept, how far I've come because I was a nightmare. When we bought a new site and I moved, they said they used to have to tractor trailer to move all my files with them. So, Tim, thoughts on how the subject or topic lands with the multi-generational workforce? Great question. Very difficult. I too struggle with this. I have 5 children, ranging from 21 to almost 28. And I do shake my head at times, probably more so than I want to admit. I think being curious, and I think someone shared that at the very beginning. I think I can't remember who it was, but saying they're curious about this. Being curious because it's trying to understand or trying not to understand, because I don't think I understand a lot of the younger generation, trying to be aware. A great example is my nephew last Christmas came to me and talking about this new job. And I said, how's it going? 350-person company. He was hired 2 months ago, just graduated college. And he was all upset. I said, what happened? Well, I've been there for a month. They're making all these changes. The CEO never even talked to me. Why would the CEO talk to you? So I tried not to laugh. I just said, okay, well, what do you think Like, what were you looking for? Well, I have a lot of ideas. I just came out of school and blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, did you talk to your manager about it? Well, no. It's like, well, you just started there. What you want to do is you want to build rapport, right? They don't know who you are. So what you need to do is start showing them your work, start showing them that you're following what they're trying to do and what they're trying to change. The same token, a friend of mine reached out to me who I've coached on and off over the years and was extremely frustrated with the changes within the company. Now, anyone that's ever done sales knows every 3 to 5 years, they change the commission structure, especially if it's a publicly traded company. So I started having the conversation with him around, and he's much younger than I am. He'd been there for 8 years. So when he's 22, he got out of college. He's 30 now. And he's going on about capitalism and going down all these other tracks. And I said, well, wait a minute. You've been here for 8 years. They changed the commission structure twice. They're now moving on the third time. He goes, yeah. I said, well, you knew this was happening. It happens currently. So what does the new commission structure look like? So we sat down and went through that commission structure, and we built out a plan where he can make the same, if not more money by adjusting how he was working. So instead of looking at, okay, this is what the problem is, which is a lot of the younger generation comes and says, hey, here's a problem, or I have a concern. Again, it's going back to when we talked about listening to their concerns. Just because they have a concern doesn't mean it has to be changed. But if you address their concern and you hear them and acknowledge it, and then maybe help them understand by saying, listen, I really can't share everything else that's going on right now. Maybe there's an acquisition, maybe there's a layoffs coming, but I can tell you this is what I know and how I think we should move forward. So again, it's not necessarily that they have to have an answer. It's that they want to be part of the conversation. They want to be part of something bigger than this. They're not, I use the analogy when I grew up in, so I'm 55. When I was in the 80s, there was a bumper sticker I loved: whoever dies with the most toys wins. That's not relevant anymore, right? What the younger generation is more focused on is not necessarily materialistic. It's that they want to be part of something they believe in. So find different ways for them to be part of something that they can feel they're part of. Maybe invite them to a meeting they normally wouldn't be invited to, just so they can hear a different perspective. So hopefully that's helpful. But yes, the multi-generational workforce. And I can tell you too, working with, and I coach some executives that are much older than I am, that haven't retired in their late 60s. And there's a struggle there too, because they're like, well, this is the way we've always done it. Right. And I have some of that in me too, because that's what I was raised with. That's what I grew up with in corporate America. We really want to try to, again, be curious. If you haven't seen Ted Lasso, this is my mug. Be curious, not judgmental. I'm really good at judging people, just so you know. I still struggle with that. So being curious about why people are asking the questions they are, there's probably something more, especially with the younger generation. The older generation, we know that, hey, this is the way if it's always been done. It's trying to give them the ability to see what can be. Any other questions before we wrap up? All right, we will send out some different papers afterwards, kind of a recap, as well as the deck and the recording. Please feel free to share. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, whether on LinkedIn or through email at robert@octahedron.app or robert.beaven@changeforce.ai. Thank you so much. And yes, that's an old typewriter with my grandfather's, a Corona. He was a Baptist minister at University of Chicago and then University of Rochester, New York, and he wrote all of his sermons on that. So I've tried using it a few times. I'm extremely slow. You don't realize when you try to type on a typewriter how slow it is. So everyone have a great week. Be safe, and look forward to hearing from you soon. Cheers. Good morning.